And now, week 4, video 6, let's talk about post-colonialism. Post-colonialism, most basically, is the period after the end of European colonialism. We're in the post-colonial period now, and actually, part of the conversation about the definition of post-colonialism states that colonialism hasn't really ended, that there are some indications that forms of colonialism continue as before. But when I talk about post-colonialism, I'm really referring, and most people in the academy are really referring to post-colonial studies, which is a field of study in anthropology, history, literature, and other fields of the relationship between European nations and the societies they colonize. So some topics in post-colonial studies, not all of them, but some of them that are interesting, include, first of all, colonial inventions. So anthropologists especially have looked at how the colonial powers sort of set up national boundaries that weren't there before, and also grouped together ethnic groups, sometimes calling them tribes, that hadn't necessarily seen themselves as a bounded group of people before. And one of the reasons I might make the comment in your essay 1 grade, anthropologists don't love the word tribe, is because we often apply that term to any kind of small-scale society. And actually a tribe is a very particular kind of political organization structure that doesn't apply to every small-scale society. Anyway, let's look at some examples. The Middle East is a fun place to look at the invention of borders and ethnic groups because so much of the contemporary Middle East is, quote-unquote, invented by colonialism. So let's just look at a couple of examples. The British colonized Iraq. So you see Iraq kind of right there in the middle of the map. And Iraq, before the colonial period, under Ottoman rule, was one big historical territory known as Iraq. And it included what you see on the map to the southeast as Kuwait. But the British looked at Iraq, and so the British got access to Iraq at the end of World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. That's when much of the Middle East sort of came open to British and French colonialism. So the British looked at Iraq and they said, gosh, this territory, they have a lot of oil, and then they have access to the Persian Gulf, which is where they can get the oil out. And that's an awful lot of power for one country to have that we're going to rule. So let's make this little country here called Kuwait and give it all of the access to the Persian Gulf. And then we'll have two modes of control that we can kind of control separately so that this one territory of Iraq doesn't have all the power. So they just carved off Kuwait. And of course, the first Gulf War in the involvement of the United States came because Iraq invaded Kuwait, because Iraq felt that Kuwait was really Iraq and they wanted to get it back. There's a lot we could talk about in Iraq. But let's look at another example of French colonialism of the territory formerly known as Asham, or Greater Syria. So now on the map you'll see Syria below Turkey, and then Lebanon sort of carved off out of Syria on the Mediterranean Sea on the west, to the west. So historically that was one big territory called Greater Syria. But the French, they looked at this territory and they said, gosh, in that little pocket right along the Mediterranean Sea, there are a lot of Christians. And then everyone else in Syria seems to be Muslim. So if we made a little country there, separate from Syria, it would be a Christian majority country. And then, you know, we would have this foothold of power in the Middle East in a Christian country. So that's what they did. They made a country called Lebanon. And it had maybe never had a Christian majority, but it had enough Christians that they could claim it was a majority. And they set it up so that Christians would rule Lebanon. And this led to a lot of problems over the time, a lot of Syrian interference in Lebanon after the end of French colonialism, and a lot of problems between the two countries and has had some influence on the war in Syria today. And then we could certainly talk about Israel and Palestine and how British, map making in those territories have led directly to a lot of the problems in the Arab-Israeli conflict today. There are lots of examples from the Middle East. And again, it just shows this kind of invention of boundaries and countries and ethnic groups, dividing ethnic groups over national borders, pulling national borders together and saying everyone in here is now their own ethnic group when they hadn't thought of themselves that way before. It's wreaked a lot of havoc on the world. But what's interesting is that it has also led people to really believe in those new ethnic identities and boundaries, such that we see within a few decades of colonialism, ethnic groups engaged in conflict and defending themselves as ethnic groups, even though those ethnic groups are kind of new and were invented by the colonial powers. So these are some of the interesting topics of post-colonial studies. Another topic is organized and everyday resistance to colonialism. So for anthropologists, it's all well and good to look at organized rebellions against the colonial powers and colonial wars that brought colonialism to an end. But it's even more interesting to look at how people resisted colonialism in their everyday lives through humor, through theater, through art, through forms of dance and martial arts, through hidden messages in the press, in films, and so forth and so on. So there's this notion that it's really the way that people resisted colonialism and giving in to how colonialism wanted to change their identity in their everyday lives that can be so interesting to study. A third topic is, how did colonialism change both the colonizers and the colonized? So early on there was a tendency, an obvious one, to look at how colonialism changed the countries that were colonized, how that colonial process affected those societies. But of course, colonialism affected the colonial powers as well. So think about how, for example, the contact with lots of different peoples of the world through colonialism led to theories of explanation of cultural diversity in Europe, such as social evolution and social Darwinism. I mean, those theories are the result of colonialism, and they changed the colonizing societies. They changed Europe profoundly. And then finally, getting back to something I mentioned earlier, one interesting question for anthropologists is, are new forms of imperialism replacing old ones? So we talked about development, for example. Is development really just colonialism in a new form? And what about tourism? We often talk about, tourism in developing countries and how much it gives to them and helps them. But actually, we find that tourism industries are very extractive. Usually the whole tourist industry is sort of owned and managed by external powers, and all the money goes out of that country and back to the European or other countries that sort of built the tourist infrastructure in the first place. So is tourism really colonialism in a new form? And then finally, globalization, which we'll talk about next week.